Hi, I'm Zachary Hunter, and welcome to the Explain It to Me podcast. EITM Pod is about info without gatekeeping and encouraging curiosity, community, and education without drowning in jargon. So, like what I did with Doctor Who of my last few episodes, I want to give newbies and people who are just casually interested in the X-Men and Marvel's Mutants an overview of this X gene positive section of the Marvel Universe. Before I do, would you please like, rate, and subscribe to EITM Pod, Explain It to Me podcast, so the algorithms let us grow this show into what I believe it can be. Thanks. I appreciate it, and you, more than you know. Okay. So the question is, what is the X-Men exactly? The way I see it, there are a few different levels you can answer this question. First, and this is probably the most literal slash historical take, is that it's a comic book series slash franchise created by Marvel Comics as Stan Lee and Jack Kirby in September 1963, featuring the quote, strangest superheroes of all, with the initial premise basically just that Stan Lee didn't want to have to keep creating origin stories, so he made their powers naturally occurring, something they were just born with. It was then canceled in 1970, X-Men, but revived in 1975 with a mostly new lineup featuring more familiar characters like Storm and Wolverine. So from 1975 until 1991, it was mostly guided by writer Chris Claremont. And the X-Men's legacy largely comes from that run of issues, along with his collaborators like Louise Simonson's work. The massive sales of X-Men and related comics around 1992 during a comic book collecting bubble, and or the 1990s cartoon that recently was revived on Disney Plus as X-Men 97. Later, from July 2019 until June 2024, the X-Men went through another popular resurgence during the so-called Krakoan era that began as the brainchild of writer Jonathan Hickman. That era has now ended, and the franchise this summer, 2024, has a new set of creative teams and is going to be under a new editor. So there's reason why now is a good time to look. A second way to look at it is if the X-Men as a franchise being a metaphor for marginalized groups and communities and or teenage wish fulfillment that through the lens of puberty and finding yourself in the world being even weirder than it already is in the real world. This mutant metaphor idea often ignores on the page how different identities interact with one another, aka intersectionality. It also requires coded language or characterization when it comes to issues like sex, gender, and other social issues that require some things to remain subtext indefinitely or not be understood or clearly visible to the people who don't belong to those groups, the out group. Moreover, this social slash political interpretation of X-Men didn't really exist on the page prior to Chris Claremont's run when female international and ethnic representation grew extensively. Stan Lee was known in his later years to claim that Professor Xavier, the head of the X-Men, and Magneto, the team's first and probably most prominent adversary, were based on Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, respectively. But that is not supported by history, nor by those men, the real men or the fictional, actual ideologies. So obviously, that is on the page somewhat. But a third way, a third facet, is to see the X Men as a football, political football, but also live dynamite financially for Marvel Comics. For example, while the 1980s run under Claremont, especially the Dark Phoenix saga, was one of the hottest things in comics, and the 1991 debut of the second X Men comic book series, often called Adjectiveless X Men, X Men number one, along with X Force number one earlier that year, which are by far the two best selling American comic books of all time. But also during the worst parts of COVID 19, during the pandemic, when many of Marvel Comics' biggest books had an X in their titles. So that was when Jonathan Hickman launched the Krakoan era. That all being said, with sales like that, you don't get that kind of success. And we're talking millions of more copies sold in the case of Adjectiveless X-Men and X-Force numbers one than the next best-selling American comic. You don't get that level of support and the level of dedication without a very strong fan base. And that fan base, frankly, X-Men fans are crazy. I'm one of them, but indeed, many X-Men fans are often very vocal and envelope pushing when it comes to representation and political positions in the text on the page in ways that would make corporations like Disney and before that Marvel as a publishing company, which for most of this time was subject to the post-McCarthyism Comics Code Authority, which I should probably do a episode on. They make those companies very uneasy. Companies don't like being uneasy. They have shareholders. They have PR. And certain things that come up in X-Men comics make those companies uneasy. And also why Marvel Comics did amazing in the early 1990s, partly due to the success of the X-Men. By the end of that decade, it had declared bankruptcy and sold off its movie rights to any and all buyers, and 20th Century Fox got the X Men. Later, once Marvel's cinematic universe became a viable idea, however, Fox's ownership of mutants became awkward. And this is, of course, before Disney owned both Fox and Marvel. But Marvel's unwillingness, understandable unwillingness, to promote another studio's movies, or even the intellectual property that they owned but didn't get as thick a cut of the revenue off of, compared to, say, Captain America. I think the record is pretty clear that it led to a marketing and editorial push for ways to focus on characters and properties that Marvel didn't have to share. So, putting this all together for these episodes, I suggest a fourth approach. This isn't against the other three, but I think it will help us approach this sprawling world of mutants within the larger Marvel universe in a more holistic way. See, because mutant abilities are innate and without specific origin stories, because of Stan Lee, like being bitten by a radioactive spider for Spider Man, caught in the radioactive gamma rays of an exploding bomb, like the Incredible Hulk, or in a comic book example not coming out of Cold War panic, an alien baby sent from his exploding planet who gets all sorts of powers from our yellow sun. But because you're just born with an X gene, you're just born that way. The For X-Men, the driving conflict slash plot thread throughout the franchise isn't with great power comes great responsibility, like in Spider-Man, or avenging his parents' death, like in Batman. It is more, in my opinion, about groups of people in conversation with, and often violent conflict over, what the X books call Xavier's dream. Charles Xavier's dream is of mutant human cooperation and coexistence. This conversation has groups ranging from for it, like the X-Men, against, a yes and approach, as if almost improv, disagreeing on methods, but other ways as well. For X-Men, what separates hate group villains, like the Friends of Humanity, the Purifiers, and recently the group Orcus, from the mutant villains and adversaries, like Magneto, Apocalypse, and mutant members of the Hellfire Club, like Emma Frost and Sebastian Shaw, is far greater than what separates those mutant baddies, quote unquote, from the heroic teams like the X-Men, X-Force, Excalibur, X-Factor, and even minor groups like X-Corp and X-Core with an S. Indeed, while the so-called Silver Age of comics, aka the 1950s through 60s, wasn't big on morally gray characters, partly because of that comics code authority that came out of McCarthyism, and in the X-Men's case, 63 to 70, the divide is clearly established between Xavier and his X-Men and Magneto with his self-called, quote unquote, Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. But once Claremont takes over, their debate is no longer about Xavier's position of assimilating and being a respectable model minority, peacefully coexisting with regular humans, versus Magneto's vision of mutant supremacy. But on the Claremont, it's rather, how do you deal with the fact that Xavier and Magneto use different tactics, not because one's all good and the other all evil, but rather that they see the question of how to protect and serve their fellow mutants fundamentally differently. Not disagreeing on that they need protection or that they need service. In the 1960s, Magneto is pretty much a mustache twirling villain, but under Claremont implicitly. And in 2008's Magneto Testament by Greg Pak explicitly, and on the movies as well, he becomes an explicitly Jewish survivor of Auschwitz, who seems to take the motto never again to mean that what happened in the Holocaust to his fellow Jews, the Romani people of his murdered wife Magda, and some of his children, like the Scarlet Witch, what happened to those groups and many others would not happen to his fellow mutants. Xavier, on the other hand, as a child of privilege raised in Westchester outside of New York City, Xavier believes, this again based on the text, that the best way to prevent such atrocities is to protect a world that hates and fears them, fears mutants, until humans and mutants on their own learn to coexist. Both approaches, though, are meant to save lives and prevent the destruction of mutants. with the issues then being that of tactics and philosophy. It's not just that Magneto is evil, at least not after that point. This is different than the mostly out of continuity but important and legendary story, quote, God Loves, Man Kills. It's a graphic novel that Marvel put out in the 80s, where racism and religious fundamentalism, quote unquote, justify mutant genocide. That and villains like that are total rejection of not just Xavier's dream, but of mutants' very humanity. Magneto struggles with doing what he thinks is right in so many stories. One such is Uncanny X-Men 150. And most attempts to return him to an uncomplicated villain who's simply, quote, one of the bad ones, end quote, as in the very successful Fatal Attractions era of the early 1980s, early 1990s during the comic book boom, not only led Chris Claremont to leave the X books for years, but also those stories tend to underscore the cliche of one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, because it's hard to say the Holocaust survivor, particularly a Holocaust survivor, a Jewish Holocaust survivor who was also there in the early days of Israel, fighting against his people's genocide, is ever going to be equivalent over the long haul to organized hate groups seeking that eradication and enslavement. Because once you establish that backstory, it's hard to walk it back. You have established that they disagree on how to protect and serve mutants, not whether mutants should be alive. Okay. So here's how this miniseries is going to break down. This intro episode was part one. Part two is going to be who are the players, aka what are the major teams and villains that you'll want to know. Part three is what are the major eras and most important stories in those eras. Part four will be more standalone stories slash comic book runs to consider along with other resources like podcasts like Jay and Miles Explain the X-Men. And part five will serve as a wrap up of in my closing thoughts that I think might help you find your way through all things related to Marvel Comics Mutants. I hope you stay tuned for those upcoming episodes. And so you don't miss out, please like, rate, and subscribe. It helped me grow EITM. And if you could, please tell your friends about the show. Um, if you have any questions or suggestions for future topics, I can be reached at EITMPOD, EITMpod at gmail.com. And if you're willing to help the show monetarily, you can go to ko-fi.com slash EITMpod, ko-fi.com slash EITMpod. But until next time, and part two, please stay safe out there. God bless, and thanks for your time.